Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look at a library of toolbar functions. In this series of videos I'll be covering the creation and use of libraries. So you might ask, why use libraries? Why not just write code whenever you need it? Well, if you're writing a lot of applications, having common libraries that contain functionality that you use often will save you time, both coding and testing. It will also make your code more readable and therefore maintainable, which is always a good thing. If you are creating a lot of Windows applications, you may well wish to put a toolbar on many of them. To save having to reinvent the wheel and put the toolbar code into every single one of your new applications, it makes sense to have some of this code in a common library, which you can merely include at the beginning of your code, and the toolbar functions can be accessed from it. So what we have here is a very simple application showing a single form. There is nothing on the form at the moment, but today we're going to add a toolbar. So since we're adding a toolbar, we will need a handle for that toolbar. So we will create a new constant called main toolbar, and we'll give that the value of 2000. Now we're going to create our resources and our function to create a generic toolbar in a separate include file. So we're going to save this toolbar library into our libraries folder. So what will we need to put into our include file? Well, our toolbar will contain icons. So we'll need to actually set up our toolbar resources to add these icons to our toolbar. So within the libraries folder, I've created a graphics folder. And inside the graphics folder, we will place all our icons. And we're going to use the resource icon command to add each of the 4 icons we're going to have in this generic toolbar to our code. Simply by using resource icon and then giving the icon a name. You can use a number or a constant, but in this case we're going to be using just a name. Makes it much easier to read in code. And we define the path to where the icon actually sits. We will include this library at the beginning of our code. Now within our library there are a few other things we'll need to add in. When a user clicks on one of the buttons of the toolbar, there has to be an event behind that button, so we can actually let the program do what it needs to. So we're going to set up some generic toolbar event handles. We're going to use a simple enumeration here. We'll set the first handle to be 4001, and each of these subsequent handles will be increased by 1. So ID reports would be 4004. These will be referred to later on in code as constants. So having set that up, we now want to create our function, a generic function to create a toolbar. We'll create a little index at the top of our library. Our function is going to be called create toolbar, and it's going to take 2 parameters. The handle of the dialog and the handle of the toolbar. So here is the start of our create toolbar function. 2 parameters, 1 for the dialog, 1 for the toolbar. We're passing both of these by val just to make sure nothing within this function will actually change the value coming in for that variable. Since our toolbar is going to contain icons, we have to create an image list first to contain those icons. We can then connect that image list to the toolbar and add the buttons to the toolbar itself based on the image list. So we'll need some variables first of all to handle all of this. The image list is a handle for the image list we're about to populate. You could well have several image lists within your application. The other variables are for the size and depth of color of your icons, and how many icons we're going to have in our image list. So we're going to go for 32-bit color depth, an icon width of 32 pixels, and a height of 32 pixels. We have to allocate space in the image list for the number of objects we're actually going to put in. In this case, 6. It pays to overestimate the number you will actually need. It does no harm to have a larger initial setting than you actually need. Next, we can create our image list. So that's the image list created with the parameters we have just populated. Next thing to do is to add each of the icons to our image list. Now I'm going to use the prefix command here to save us a little bit of typing. All the prefix command does is it takes this string of text and at compilation time it adds this to the beginning of each of the next lines within the prefix block. Keeps the code nice and tidy and saves you a bit of typing. Now all we're going to do is to add each of the icons in turn by their name. As you'll remember, when we created the icons in as a resource, we named each of them specifically. And we use each of these names, enclosed in double quotes, to add them to our image list. So now that we have the icons in the image list, we just have to say which order they're going to appear on the toolbar. And again, we'll make use of the prefix command. When you're using the toolbar add button command, you're specifying which of the items in the image list we're actually adding. In this case, we're adding the first item, the second, the third, and the fourth. Now these numbers can be whatever sequence you've actually added them to the image list, but this first row will add the first button. Now it could be coming in this case from the first element in the image list, or it could be coming from the 10th, depending how you've set them up. The other thing we're adding in are these constants. These are going to be the events which will be triggered when the user clicks on the buttons. And these we did set up earlier in our toolbar event handles. The constant is preceded by a percentage ID add, and there is your percentage ID add. So the last thing we need to do in this function is to connect the image list to the toolbar. Using the toolbar setImageList. Takes 4 parameters, the dialog handle, the toolbar handle, and the image list handle, finishing off with a 0. So here is our dialog, and here is our dialog show command. We will need to put the call to our new function before the dialog is actually shown. So before we call the new function, we will actually add a toolbar to our dialog. This uses the constant we set up at the beginning, main toolbar. So now that we have that in place, we should be able to actually run our program now. And there is a dialog with 4 buttons on the toolbar with the icons we provided. 1 to add, 1 to save, 1 for reports, and 1 for help. Now at the moment there is no code behind each of these buttons, but that's our next task. But before we do that, let's put an icon on the dialog itself at the top left hand corner. If we go back to the dialog itself, before we actually show the dialog, we'll put a command in to set the icon for the dialog. That's quite simply a dialog set icon command. Now I've given this named icon here, which we're going to have to load in. So we go back to the beginning of our code, and after we've called the toolbar library, we'll want to set up any of our resources specific to this application itself. Each application, of course, could have a different icon. So now we have that in place. If we run the application now, we'll see that the dialog itself has a small icon up at the top left-hand corner. So now that we have all this in place, and we wish to add some code behind one of these toolbar buttons, can we use that to trigger a toolbar on the second dialog? Well, let's go into our Forms Designer and we will add a new dialog. Simply clicking on a new button gives us another dialog. We will set its basic properties by double clicking, going into Styles, and we'll set the caption, the sys menu, the minimize, the maximize, and we will center it on the screen. And we will give a name to this dialog. We'll call this Dialog Reports. And we'll just change the caption to Reports. So if we save that and load our application up again, we now have a new dialog, as you'll see from the code finder. So since our intention is to add a toolbar on that dialog as well, If we look at where we set our main toolbar, we can then create a new constant for our reports toolbar. We can quite easily add another toolbar to this new one, exactly the way we did it on the first one. If we look at the example we put in here, we added a toolbar and we called the create toolbar function. So if we copy that code and do the same in our reports one, we'll add our toolbar, we'll use the reports toolbar function, and we'll call create toolbar with reports toolbar. Now that will actually display the toolbar on our reports dialog when it's called. All we have to do is to make a call to that when the event is actually triggered from the main dialog. So if we have a look at the event handler for the main dialog, we'll see at the moment there is nothing in wm command. We're going to give in here in our library an example of what the calls to these will actually be. And this you can then paste in to any application you're using later. So we're going to handle the reports one. So we'll take this section of code and we will put this in to our event handler for the main dialog. So it's looking at this event here, the ID reports, and if the button is pressed, we can call something in here. And we're going to be calling the reports one. So we have to do a simple call to that with its single parameter, which is the dialog we're currently on, which we can use cvhandle to work that out for you. So if we run the code now, we will get our main dialog coming up with the toolbar. If we click on the reports button, it will give us a second dialog, which is also populated very straightforwardly with the 4 toolbar buttons. None of these have any code behind them, so they will not do anything. So we have created a toolbar include file. If you have a standard set of toolbars which you wish to display on some or all of your client applications, this is a very easy way to create and populate it, as the library can be reused indefinitely. If you had the need for different toolbars on different parts of the application, you can quite easily clone the toolbar include file to contain whatever resources you think are necessary. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.